To the Middle East now. We're in the eastern Syria city of Deir ez-Zor. It's been under intense attacks for the past week. We're talking about a city that the UN estimates has around 93,000 civilians, 40,000 of them children. ISIS fighters and government forces near Deir ez-Zor are going head to head. The Russian Defense Ministry reports that it is conducting airstrikes against ISIS there, attacking the terrorists' command centers and weapon stockpiles. Let's bring in independent journalist Rania Khalek. Rania, we're talking about a serious offensive, a lot of lives at risk. If you Google this, though, we'll see an RT article, maybe an Al Jazeera article, but nothing else. Why aren't we hearing more coverage of it?
Well, because the fact of the matter is that Deir ez-Zor is a government-held area that is surrounded by ISIS, and people living in government areas don't seem to matter to the media here. And you don't hear Deir ez-Zor in the news the way you do, like, say, Aleppo a few weeks ago, which was, back-to-back headlines. And that was largely due to the fact that there was also a massive PR effort behind the situation in Aleppo, and that also played into the geopolitical interests that were on the side of the U.S., where the U.S. wanted, the rebels to win. Whereas in the area in Deir ez-Zor, the government is the one that's, has to deal with ISIS, and they, the U.S. doesn't really care if the government gains or loses territory. In fact, the U.S. government has, in many ways, helped contribute to ISIS taking more territory, like parts of Deir ez-Zor.
Well, regardless of who controls the territory, we're talking about citizens here. And the fact is that ISIS is really making ground there. What is making Deir ez-Zor more vulnerable to ISIS?
Well, a few months ago in September, you might remember the U.S. repeatedly dropped bombs on the military airport in Deir ez-Zor and killed, I think it was up to 80 or more Syrian soldiers. There were Syrian army soldiers stationed there. And an internal investigation revealed that it was likely deliberate on the part of the U.S. military. And this actually made it more difficult for the government to, to keep the area under its control and to do airdrops around Deir ez-Zor. And this actually led to ISIS gaining more traction because you got rid of a bunch of special operations forces that were in the area. There's also the issue of Mosul. You were just reporting on what's going on in Mosul and how there's areas that have been liberated from ISIS. Well, a lot of those ISIS fighters have actually gone in to Syria, to Deir ez-Zor. And I mean, the U.S. State Department said they know that this happened. They kind of watched it happen. So that's one of the reasons they've been able to gain traction here.
Okay, and for the record, the U.S. government says that it was an accident that bombing happened. But speaking of the U.S. government, we've heard leaked audio from former Secretary of State John Kerry, and it indicates that Kerry thought that ISIS would actually end up weakening Assad to the point where Assad would negotiate with the U.S., who originally their goal was to have Assad be removed from government. So instead of this playing out the way that apparently, based on these leaked audio, Kerry thought it would, Assad ended up turning to Russia. With that, we have Russia's Air Force support for the Syrian government. Is the government, in that respect, equipped to handle this fight against ISIS in Syria, especially when it comes to places like Deir ez-Zor, where you're not seeing other coalition forces helping?
Well, yeah, I mean, with the help of the Russian government and other allies of the Syrian government, yes, at this point. But the fact of the matter is that what you just talked about with John Kerry admitting that on audio, the U.S. really, I mean, starting in like 2012, there was a Defense Intelligence Agency report for the U.S. government that basically said they wanted to have a Salafist principality, they called it, in eastern Syria to help weaken the Syrian government. I mean, throughout this entire conflict, the U.S. has tried to use these jihadist groups, including ISIS, to weaken the Syrian government. And even when it didn't directly do it, I mean, just by arming rebels that diverted the Syrian army's attention away from dealing with ISIS, helped empower ISIS. And that's how it took over more areas. Whenever the U.S. would arm the rebels and its allies would arm the rebels, the one group that was capable of fighting ISIS, which is the Syrian army, would have to go deal with the rebels, and then you'd have ISIS take over some more territory. So the U.S.'s entire policy in Syria, really from the beginning of this war, has empowered jihadist groups like ISIS and like Al-Qaeda. And so at this point, I mean, and you mentioned the U.S. saying, yes, it was a mistake, what happened in Deir ez-Zor. Well, I mean, Gareth Porter, a really excellent investigative journalist, actually studied the internal investigation by the military forces on this report, like on what happened in Deir ez-Zor. And I mean, it basically comes to the conclusion that the military did it deliberately in an effort to sabotage Obama's attempt to have a ceasefire with Russia. And so, the U.S. has been playing a really dirty game in Syria, and the media's played along with it. And now that you have what you mentioned was almost 100,000 civilians trapped inside an area surrounded by ISIS, the only thing standing in between them and ISIS taking over and just committing a bloodbath is the Syrian army. And it's utterly shocking that this is getting zero attention in the U.S. mainstream press, but it's understandable why.
Do people want to see the U.S. get involved and help the Syrian government? Do they want to see the U.S. just stay out of Syria completely?
I think the U.S. population is they don't want much to do with Syria. But if you want to fight ISIS, regardless of whether you like the Syrian government or not, you kind of have to ally with the Syrian government to fight ISIS. You need some sort of popular front here. And so the U.S. needs to let go of this policy of trying to weaken the Syrian government, because by doing that, you basically empower ISIS.
Okay, so we've been listening to Trump in his first week in office. How do you think the Trump administration will deal with Syria?
Well, I think the Trump administration, so far, it seems like they want some sort of alliance with Russia, which is what Obama was starting to lean towards. And I think the situation in Syria is winding down because the government is clearly winning. So I think what you're going to see is less attention paid to Syria. And it seems actually more attention is going to start being paid to Iran. It already has been. And I think that's where Trump and his cabinet members are eyeing some sort of confrontation with Iran and moving their eyes towards there.
Independent journalist Rania Khalek, thank you so much for coming on.
Great to be on with you.
Speaking of money, Senate Democrats want to spend $1 trillion of your tax dollars to rebuild America's crumbling infrastructure. The question is, will President Trump go along? Chief political correspondent Carl Cameron looks at the prospects.
We will build new roads and highways and bridges and airports.
Seizing on President Trump's inaugural address, reiterating campaign promises to repair the nation's aging infrastructure, Democrats unveiled a plan to spend $1 trillion over 10 years.
He campaigned on a promise of bigger and better infrastructure. This plan is the way to make it happen.
Among other big-ticket items, Democrats would spend $210 billion repairing roads and bridges, $180 billion upgrading rail and bus systems, $110 billion improving water and sewer infrastructure, $100 billion to modernize the electrical grid, $75 billion for schools, and $70 billion for deeper ports, improved shipping waterways, and airports.
We can create up to 15 million decent-paying jobs.
Democrats hope 15 million new jobs will appeal to President Trump. President Obama's attempts at a so-called infrastructure surge were opposed by most Republicans because it would have increased the national debt.
And we call on the president to persuade his Republican colleagues in the House and Senate to drop their opposition to investing in infrastructure and get on board with this plan.
But the Democrats' plan for direct federal spending faces huge resistance on the Hill. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell doused ice water on the Democrats' plan.
I don't think we ought to borrow almost $1 trillion and plus up a bunch of federal accounts, incur a lot of additional debt, and don't build any projects to speak of.
The president's plan is expected to offer tax credits to private sector business that join in public-private infrastructure projects. Trump's team has said the White House plan will not increase the debt. Congressional Republicans want to see the fine print.
We have a $21 trillion debt, but I think we would all like to tackle infrastructure.
President Trump's promise to rebuild America's infrastructure and reduce the national debt. Doing both is going to be difficult, and this is only the beginning of an infrastructure battle in Washington that's likely to last all year. Chris?